The first thing she heard that morning was a stranger's voice telling her she didn't belong here. It came sharply, almost slicing through the quiet hallway outside the patient's room. "I asked for a doctor," the woman said, her tone stiff with certainty. "Not the cleaning staff." For a moment, the air held still, and the silence that followed was heavy enough to press against the walls. "And before I take you any further, tell me this: where are you watching from tonight? Which city, which place in the world are you listening from? And if stories like this catch your attention, make sure you subscribed and leave a quick like below so you don't miss what comes next." Now, back to that morning, and to the words that set everything in motion. The remark wasn't shouted, but it carried the weight of someone who had said similar things many times before, someone who believed she could define others with a single glance. The nurse standing nearby froze, unsure whether to intervene or pretend she had heard nothing at all. The patient's daughter shifted uncomfortably, whispering something to her mother that only made her purse her lips tighter, as though she had already made up her mind and didn't intend to change it. But the woman being spoken to didn't react at first. She simply stood there, listening, letting the insult settle before she answered. She had been called many things throughout her life, and she had learned the hard way that some battles had to start slowly, without anger, without the crack of a raised voice. She had walked into that room with one purpose: to help a patient whose condition had worsened overnight, and now she was being asked to leave by someone who didn't know her name, didn't know her training, didn't know the years she had spent studying long after her friends fell asleep, the nights she practiced until her hands trembled, the mornings she arrived before sunrise just to keep up with the impossible schedules that shaped her early career. None of that mattered to the woman in the bed. All she saw was a stranger who, in her mind, didn't match the picture of a doctor. The patient pointed toward the door, her expression serious enough to convince the nurse to take a step back. "Please get the doctor," she insisted. "The real one." The irony, of course, was that the real doctor was already in the room. She inhaled slowly, letting the frustration pass through her like a tide. She knew this type of confrontation. She had handled versions of it since medical school, when professors doubted her abilities, before she had even spoken, when patients refused to make eye contact if they didn't approve of who stood beside their bed. And still, after all these years, it stung. She introduced herself again, calmly, clearly, hoping for logic to soften the woman's stance. But before she could finish the sentence, the patient interrupted with a wave of her hand, as though brushing off an inconvenience. "No," she said firmly. "I want the doctor in charge, not you." The nurse tried to step forward, tried to offer a gentle correction, but the patient's daughter tugged her arm, whispering that arguing would only upset her mother further. And so the nurse hesitated, caught between the truth and the tension filling the room, her eyes flicking back and forth like she was waiting for permission to speak. The doctor felt a familiar ache build in her chest, a mixture of disappointment and exhaustion. She knew she could walk away. She knew that if she stepped out, someone else could come in, someone the patient would find more acceptable. It would be easier, faster, less humiliating. But she also knew the patient's condition was worsening, and delaying care could become dangerous. So she stood there a moment longer, weighing her options, choosing not to retreat even as the patient's glare made it clear she wasn't welcome. She had promised herself long ago that she would not allow ignorance to decide when she stepped forward and when she stepped back. She had faced harsher words before, harsher judgments, moments that pushed her far beyond comfort. But the beginning of this story isn't just about the insult that was spoken. It's about the moment she realized this would not be another passing slight she could ignore. Something about the patient's insistence, the coldness in her voice, the way everyone else in the room chose silence, it all carried the weight of a confrontation that would not dissolve on its own. As she tried once more to explain who she was and why she was there, the patient raised her voice for the first time, sharp enough that two people walking past the door turned to look. "Get out," she demanded. "Send me someone qualified." The doctor stood still, the words echoing through her mind, not because they were new, but because they were said in a moment when she was trying desperately to place the patient's health above her own pride. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room waiting to see what she would do next. And though she remained calm on the surface, she sensed that the situation would become far more complicated than anyone expected. She did not know yet how many people would become involved, or how quickly rumors would spread through the hospital corridors, or how deeply this misunderstanding would cut into the plans for the operation scheduled later that day. She only knew that the line had been drawn, not by her, but by someone who refused to see beyond their assumptions. And standing in that doorway, she understood that this was only the beginning, and nothing about the hours ahead would unfold quietly. The tension from that morning didn't fade as the hours passed. Instead, it wound itself deeper into the day, spreading through whispers in the hallway and lingering in every conversation that should have been simple. News of the confrontation traveled faster than anyone expected, retold in fragments by nurses who had only heard pieces of it and embellished by staff who hadn't been there at all. Some repeated the story with disbelief, others with a quiet sigh of familiarity, but everyone agreed the situation was spiraling into something no one wanted to deal with. The doctor tried to focus on her rounds, telling herself that staying busy would steady her mind, yet every time she crossed paths with someone who had heard the rumors, she felt the weight of their lingering questions. They weren't doubting her, not exactly, but they were wondering how far the conflict would go. She could feel it in the way they paused before speaking to her, in the way they exchanged glances when they thought she wasn't looking, and she carried the memory of the patient's demand with her, the sharpness of those words replaying again and again as though they were stuck behind her ribs. She needed to return to the room eventually, whether the patient liked it or not, because medical responsibilities didn't bend for personal discomfort. But she could not ignore the growing tension, nor the way the patient's influence was beginning to affect the rest of the staff. By midday, administrators were already aware something had happened. A supervisor approached her in the hallway, speaking with a tone that attempted calm but revealed concern beneath the surface. He asked if everything was under control, and she answered honestly that the situation was delicate, but manageable. That wasn't entirely true. Nothing felt manageable. Still, she wasn't ready to admit that the patient's refusal to accept her as the doctor had become more than an insult. It was slowing critical decisions, delaying treatments, and forcing others to navigate around someone's prejudice instead of focusing on healing. She kept moving forward, keeping her posture steady, refusing to let frustration show, because she knew that anything she said or did could later be twisted into something it wasn't. She had lived long enough in professional spaces to understand that she couldn't afford to react emotionally, not even when justified. She reminded herself that her job was to protect lives, even when the people she was trying to help made it difficult. As the day went on, the patient insisted on seeing a senior doctor, and the request created a storm of complications. The surgeon overseeing the department was in back-to-back procedures and couldn't leave the operating room. Another physician reviewed the case, but admitted that the woman scheduled for the operation was the most qualified person to handle it. None of this mattered to the patient, who refused to listen, insisting her health was at risk if she stayed under the care of someone she didn't trust. Her distrust was not based on skill or experience or anything grounded in reality. It was based on an assumption she clung to with unshakable certainty, and every attempt to reason with her only deepened her resistance. The doctor found herself standing outside the patient's room once more, preparing to enter, not to argue, but to explain medical facts the woman needed to hear. She rehearsed the information in her mind, planning how to deliver it concisely, calmly, without emotion. But when she stepped inside, she saw the patient's daughter sitting by the bed, her expression tired, her hands clasped tightly as though she had been waiting for this moment. The daughter apologized before anything else, her voice soft, almost pleading, but the patient quickly interrupted her, accusing her of taking sides. The room was thick with tension, and the doctor realized that any words she spoke would be overshadowed by the woman's assumptions. Still, she explained the test results, the progression of the condition, the urgency of the upcoming procedure. She kept her voice steady, hoping logic might finally reach the patient. But the woman stared at her with the same cold certainty she had shown that morning, insisting she wanted someone competent, someone reliable, someone who fit the role she imagined in her mind. The accusation lingered between them, unmistakable in its meaning, impossible to ignore. The doctor felt the weight of the words like a tide rising against her, threatening to pull her under. She ended the conversation with professionalism, even as frustration smoldered quietly beneath her calm surface. When she stepped out into the hallway, she found another colleague waiting nearby, someone who had clearly overheard enough of the exchange to feel uncomfortable. He offered to speak with the patient himself, thinking perhaps a different face might calm the situation. She agreed, not because she doubted her own abilities, but because the patient's condition required cooperation, and stubbornness could no longer be allowed to interfere. But when he entered the room, the patient's response surprised everyone. She welcomed him immediately, thanked him for coming, insisted she finally felt she was in safe hands. She asked him questions she had refused to ask earlier, listened to his explanations without resistance, even smiled for the first time that day. And yet, she didn't realize she was asking those questions to someone who had been trained by the very doctor she rejected, guided through years of experience by the person she insisted didn't look the part. The colleague exited the room later with an expression that said he understood exactly what had happened. He told her quietly that nothing he said had changed the situation. The patient was still demanding another surgeon, someone she believed would fit better, though she never explained what that meant. The day stretched on with no progress. Every decision that should have been made quickly was slowed by resistance, and every moment that could have been spent preparing for the operation was spent navigating the patient's objections. And as the afternoon slipped into evening, the doctor realized something important. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It had grown into a challenge that threatened to interfere with the patient's safety, the team's efficiency, and the trust that held the entire department together. She knew Act 2 was closing, but the conflict was far from resolved. The storm that began with a single insult was now gathering momentum, and she could sense the turning point approaching. The moment when everything would be forced into the open, and the truth would have to stand on its own. By the time the final hours of the day arrived, the conflict had grown into something no one could ignore. The patient's condition was becoming more unstable, and even those who had tried to stay distant from the situation now understood that avoiding the truth was no longer an option. Every delay, every moment spent arguing instead of preparing, had pushed her closer to a dangerous threshold. And the doctor, who had been rejected all morning, found herself standing at the center of a decision that would affect not only the patient, but everyone involved. She had remained calm through every insult, quiet through every assumption, steady through every whisper. But as the patient's chart grew more concerning and the urgency became undeniable, she knew this was the moment when hesitation could cost far more than pride. The senior surgeon was still unavailable, and the colleague who tried to mediate earlier admitted he did not have the experience needed for the procedure. The truth settled over the team like a final, immovable fact. The only person fully prepared to handle the operation was the very doctor the patient had refused to accept. The supervisor gathered the staff, his voice low but firm, explaining that medical ethics didn't bend to personal bias. The patient needed care from the most qualified professional, and at this moment, that was her. For a moment, there was silence. A long, heavy pause that felt like the room itself was holding its breath. She could feel the pressure building at her temples, the exhaustion of carrying the weight of the entire day, the unspoken expectation that she would somehow rise above the hurt once again. And she would, not for the sake of pride, not for the sake of proving anyone wrong, but because the patient deserved the best chance at recovery, even if she didn't recognize it. When she entered the room again, the patient's daughter stood up immediately, her eyes filled with worry rather than resistance. She had been watching her mother decline throughout the day, and fear had softened her earlier stubbornness. She apologized again quietly, but the patient still looked away, refusing to meet the doctor's eyes. It was the daughter who finally spoke up, urging her mother to listen, explaining that delaying any longer might lead to consequences none of them were prepared for. The patient hesitated, her pride clinging to the last remnants of false certainty, but weakness showed in her posture, in the tremor of her hands, in the dawning realization that the body does not negotiate with prejudice. She gave a reluctant nod, not with grace, but with necessity. And it was the first moment all day when the stubbornness cracked enough for truth to seep through. The team moved quickly after that, gathering what they needed, reviewing details, making sure every step was aligned with precision. As the doctor prepared herself, she felt a quiet fire settle inside her, not anger, not bitterness, but a determination carved from years of proving her worth in places where some people refused to see it. She performed the operation with the same skill she had brought to every procedure before it, guided by discipline, training, and a level of focus that allowed no outside noise to interfere. The room was steady, the team unified, and the patient's life held carefully in hands she had tried to push away. Hours later, when it was finally over and the danger had passed, the doctor stepped out into the hallway, her body tired but her mind clear. She had done her job, not for recognition, not for validation, but because integrity demanded it. The patient woke slowly, the world returning to her in fragments, and the first face she saw was the daughter's, relieved, grateful, shaken. When the doctor entered the room again, the patient did not speak at first. She looked at her with an expression that carried the weight of everything that had happened, the assumptions, the accusations, the resistance that nearly cost her far more than dignity. It wasn't an apology spoken in words, not yet, but it was the closest she had come to acknowledging the truth. Eventually, she whispered a thank you, so quiet it barely reached the air between them, but the meaning was unmistakable. The doctor nodded once, accepting the moment without dwelling on it, because humility mattered more than triumph. Later, the colleagues who witnessed the day unfold approached her with quiet respect. Some apologized for not stepping in sooner. Others simply expressed admiration for the way she carried herself through the storm. She appreciated their words, but she didn't need them. The real victory was knowing she had done what was right even when the path was steep and unfair. And in the quiet aftermath of it all, the lesson of the day settled like a final chord, that prejudice may delay truth, but it cannot erase it, and dignity has a way of rising where doubt once stood. Her strength was not in proving others wrong, but in holding steady while they learned to see what had been true all along. If you've stayed with the story to the end, I want to thank you for listening, and I'd love to hear your thoughts below. And before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. It truly helps bring more stories like this to life.